All right, guys. Today we're going to start talking about the unit entitled Challenges of the 70s. Like it says here, after World War II, the United States took a very strong stance against the containment of communism anywhere in the world. So if you guys can recall over the past few units, we got into this right after World War II, which is, you have the United States and the Soviet Union emerging victorious from World War II. And then after the war was over, a new war emerged, which was the Cold War, which was just like that first bullet is stating, this ongoing conflict between the United States, a capitalist democratic society, versus communism, which was, the ideology that was trying to be spread by the Soviet Union. So the second bullet says, in the mid-1960s, the United States got involved in a war with Vietnam, which had won its independence from the French in 1954. The conflict, which lasted longer than a decade, left bitter feelings between the United States and Vietnam. And you can see here up on the left, this war would span the presidencies of three different men. So it sort of starts with JFK. And I know I talked about this a lot, but basically JFK was in the process of ending U.S. involvement in Vietnam. So he was starting to withdraw troops, as we actually saw in that video that we had watched a couple weeks ago. And then we'll talk about all this stuff, but LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, he's going to obviously pick up where JFK leaves off, but he's going to escalate the war. So we'll get into the details of this, but whereas JFK was getting out of Vietnam, LBJ then comes in after JFK's assassination and he escalates the war. And then this guy down here, we haven't gotten to him yet, but this President Richard Nixon, he's going to be the one that, makes the promise to the American people to end the war in Vietnam. And so Vietnam, you can call it Vietnam, Nam, any of those works. When we watch Forrest Gump, he calls it Vietnam. So that's kind of how he pronounces it. Like I said, it's, tomato type thing. Nothing's wrong. But this is a famous picture of a young soldier. And I think the reason this picture was so famous was it just kind of showed you that a lot of the guys over there fighting were not very old. I mean, look at this guy. He's got to be at least 18, but, he doesn't look much older than you guys, and he wasn't. A lot of you guys are 16 by now. And like I said, these soldiers, you can serve in war by the age of 18. So, there was a lot of young men over there fighting and losing their lives for a war that the nation was very divided upon, and we'll talk more about that later. This is just a quick summary of the war. So
bloodiest struggles of the Cold War era. How did it start? And how long did it last? What most people call the Vietnam War began in 1946, and at the time was known as the Indochina War. French forces fought against rebelling forces known as the Viet Minh. The two sides fought for nearly 10 years, and the end result was the creation of two nations, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam was led by its founder, Ho Chi Minh, who desired to gain control of the entire former French colony and institute communism nationwide. South Vietnam, under Ngo Dinh Diem, had established a republic. In 1959, North Vietnam, aided by the Soviet Union, attacked South Vietnam. The United States saw this as a Soviet effort to expand communism, and throughout the early 1960s, sent soldiers to South Vietnam in the form of advisors to assist the training of South Vietnamese forces. By 1963, 16,000 Americans were stationed in Southeast Asia. In August of 1964, 2 American ships were reportedly fired upon in the Gulf of Tonkin. This resulted in the U.S. Congress passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Lyndon Johnson authority to conduct military operations in Vietnam in order to protect U.S. personnel. The first American combat troops arrived in Vietnam in 1965. Throughout South Vietnam, North Vietnamese supporters, known as the Viet Cong, fought a guerrilla war against U.S. and South Vietnamese troops. A guerrilla war is one in which hit-and-run tactics are used in order to avoid a direct military confrontation. The North Vietnamese Army also engaged in a more traditional, drawn-out war against American forces. U.S. involvement in Vietnam reached its peak with a Viet Cong attack known as the Tet Offensive. It's known by this name because it occurred during the Vietnamese holiday known as Tet. The Vietnam conflict was widely covered by the American media, and the effectiveness of the well-organized Tet Offensive by enemy forces greatly damaged public support for U.S. involvement in the conflict. Following this incident, the U.S. began the process of Vietnamization. This meant gradually turning the war over to the South Vietnamese as U.S. soldiers were slowly withdrawn. The fighting officially stopped in January of 1973 with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. Once U.S. forces were completely withdrawn, the North Vietnamese resumed their attacks, and Vietnam was reunited as a communist nation, which it still remains today. Throughout the Vietnam conflict, well over 1 million Vietnamese died, and 58,000 American soldiers also lost their lives.
All right, so like I said, just kind of a little summary there, but we'll go into a lot of that stuff more in depth here. So Vietnam itself was the easternmost country of Southeast Asia. You can see we have China up here. Here's Thailand. You know, Vietnam is just this little stretch of land that runs along the coast. It is bordered on the north by China, like I said, west by Laos and Cambodia. Vietnam's population is centered around the Red River Delta and the Mekong Delta. Those were kind of like their main water sources. Mekong, Red River up here. So that's where a lot of their civilization was. Chinese occupation. Because of the abundant amount of rice fields in Vietnam, China tried for many centuries to spread her influence into northern and central Vietnam. Le Loi in 1428 and his Vietnamese followers drove out the Chinese and became independent. So Vietnam has, you know, and this is actually really important to kind of understand in order to understand what this conflict was all about, but Vietnam had a long history of invaders trying to conquer them. And you know, so this was kind of like, this became their way of life, was, you know, basically fighting wars against foreign invaders. And like it says here, I mean, this stretches back centuries when China had actually tried to conquer Vietnam because, you know, again, they just had valuable resources and things of that nature. And so the Vietnamese people, they were used to this. I mean, this had gone on for generations, was their, you know, their fathers and forefathers had fought these wars against these foreign invaders, and that was just sort of like the life that they inherited. And so, you know, when the United States, and we'll get to this, but eventually we're going to, you know, be the next, you know, version of foreign invaders that come in there. And, you know, we were trying to stop the spread of communism, which we'll talk more about here in a second, but that's what we were seen as by the Vietnamese people, was just the next foreign invader. So we were just the next enemy that was there for them to fight. So it was something that they had become used to. They were accustomed to it, and, you know, it was a long part of their history. So French colonization, like it says here, Vietnam lost its independence in the mid-1800s during a surge of French imperialism. So they had driven out the Chinese earlier, and now the French come in. And this was during a time period, you can see here it says in the mid-1800s. So there was a time period known as the Age of Imperialism. And you guys will learn about this in world history. But essentially what it was all these world powers were going around the world and trying to basically conquer new lands. And it was the French, it was the British, you know, I mean, eventually it would become the United States, you know, the Spanish. They were, you know, going around the world and just, they were trying to just scoop up as much land as they could take. And, you know, that was seen as acceptable. I mean, today when we see a country invade another country and try to overtake it, it's oftentimes frowned upon. And, you know, it's kind of a similar situation going on in the Ukraine, where Russia invades Ukraine, and, you know, that's kind of going on right now. But like I said, during this age of imperialism, you know, France was one of the most powerful countries in the world. So Vietnam was one of the countries that they tried to conquer, and they did. But like it says here, in 1883, France had complete control over Vietnam and combined Laos and Cambodia to form French Indochina. So for a long time, this nation, Vietnam, along with Laos and Cambodia, was known as French Indochina. And that was just the situation for a number of decades. So like it says here, Vietnamese independence. So during the 1920s and 1930s, communist leader Ho Chi Minh gained power and worked to gain Vietnamese independence once again. So this guy, Ho Chi Minh, comes to power and he says, we're going to drive out these foreign invaders once again, like we always have. And it says here he utilized the tiger and elephant philosophy. And what that means is, according to this philosophy, a tiger can take down an elephant, but not if it takes it head on. The tiger needs to use its agility, its quickness, its speed, and bite at the elephant piece by piece. And by doing that, the tiger can eventually defeat the elephant. And that's kind of the philosophy that the Vietnamese would adopt against this much bigger, more powerful enemy, such as the United States. We're a world superpower at this point, right? And so if the Vietnamese, I mean, they're, they don't have the resources and capabilities like us as far as military and stuff like that, tanks, planes, guns, all those things. Now, they were being supplied by our enemies, the Chinese, the Soviets, their communist allies. They were giving the Vietnamese weapons and things of that nature, but just compared to the U.S., they didn't have the manpower or the military might that we had. So they knew that if they tried to fight us head on, that wasn't going to work. And so that's what this means by they utilize the tiger and elephant philosophy. So this guy, Ho Chi Minh, his name means the bringer of light, and in our eyes, he is the communist bad guy, right? He's kind of like the leader of the communist regime in Vietnam, and, he's the one that we were trying to take out. I'm just going to keep going here. So France and the Viet Minh go to war. So in 1941, Ho Chi Minh secretly organized a resistance in Vietnam called the League for the Independence of Vietnam, or Viet Minh. So when you hear the word Viet Minh, that's who they're talking about, is the North Vietnamese communists. So like it says here, the United States supported the French, and who was a vital ally in the struggle against communism. So we were supporting the French because we didn't want the communists to overtake Vietnam completely and then, essentially, would carry on with this communist takeover of the world. That was our biggest fear. Keep in mind, like after World War II, our biggest fear was communism would take over the world. And so this was one of those small battles in fighting this war on communism. So in 1949, Mao Zedong conquered China, and he was a communist. So the United States was afraid of communism taking over all of Asia. So again, when China became communist, it was like our worst fear coming true. And I don't know if you guys remember this, but we had talked about this back in the 1950s when President Eisenhower was in office, and he coined this the domino theory, meaning that as one nation falls to communism, they would all start to fall just like dominoes, and next thing you know, the whole world is communist, and we're the only non-communist country standing. So the United States aided France in their effort, but the French were unsuccessful, and after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French would basically give up, surrender, and withdraw. So this battle, Dien Bien Phu, that was a major turning point in this, Vietnamese movement for independence, because the French had been there for a while, and then after this battle, it was a significant defeat by of the French. They just said, "That's it. It's not worth it. We're leaving." And so the United States, obviously, we didn't like that because we wanted them to win there. And so you can see here, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, here's where they're divided. So the 17th parallel. Similar to when we talked about Korea, North and South Korea on the 38th parallel, it's a similar situation. So the Geneva Conference was an international meeting among Cambodia, Great Britain, Laos, China, the Soviet Union, and the United States. A ceasefire was agreed to, but no definite political settlement was ever achieved. Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, as I just showed you. The Viet Minh, or the North Vietnamese communists, controlled the north, and the French controlled the south. So that's kind of what was going on prior to this whole eruption of a conflict between us and the communists in Vietnam. So the rule of No Dinh Diem, and this guy was mentioned in that video a second ago. No Dinh Diem takes power in the South. So he was a former government official under the French. So he was a French ally and an anti-communist. Like it says here, he was a strong nationalist and against communism. So we supported him. He was very disliked, and by the mid-1950s, there was an armed revolution that had erupted in the South in opposition of this guy that we supported. So Southern Viet Minh formed the National Liberation Front, and their main goal was to overthrow Diem's government. In South Vietnam, so we had the Viet Minh in the north, and I know this gets confusing. I'm just trying to clarify it. So we had the Viet Minh in the north, right? But in the south, they were called the Viet Cong, which stood for Vietnamese Communists. So you have communists on both sides in the north and the south, but the south is being controlled by non-communists. But you still have a communist regime in the south that are sort of like rebels. So the north is being controlled by the communists and the south has their own, but they're sort of fighting against the people who are running South Vietnam. And so, but anyways, Viet Cong are the South Vietnamese communists. Viet Cong soldier there. They use the AK-47, and I won't get into this too much, but this is a Soviet-made weapon, right? In the United States, we had the M16. And there have been videos, and again, you can look this up on YouTube, but they compare the two rifles, and it's been found that the AK-47 was a more effective weapon. It's got a larger caliber, it shoots better, it doesn't jam. I've personally shot this gun. This is what we had when I served, and this thing jams up all the time. I mean, I was on the course, and every couple shots I was firing, it jammed. So they had to clean these guns all the time. And you can see here, I think when we watched Forrest Gump, they mentioned this, like, keep your gun clean all the time or something like that, because, you don't want to be in combat and your gun jams up. But you could also hear a distinction between these two guns firing, so you could tell when it was enemy fire as opposed to friendly fire. But these were being provided by communist allies, the Soviets, the Chinese. They were giving them weapons to fight. And so U.S. involvement deepens. JFK supported the domino theory and sought to aid South Vietnam to assert American power. JFK sent about 16,000 troops to Vietnam by 1963. 500 were killed or wounded. So we did have a small contingent of soldiers there in support of the South. As I mentioned before, we did support the French until they were defeated and said, we're getting out of here. After that, the United States came in, and we, like it says here, we had a small group of soldiers there, but we were there more on an advisory basis, meaning like we weren't really fighting an all-out war. And then, as I mentioned before, in the video we watched on JFK's assassination talked about this, right before his death, he actually was signing bills to get the U.S. out of Vietnam and giving orders to, like, get our guys out of there. And so a lot of historians say if JFK wouldn't have been killed, we would have never gotten involved in this war, to the extent that we did, but it is what it is. So Diem's overthrow. The United States sent Henry Cabot Lodge to discuss the Kennedy agenda to stop Diem's abuse of power. So this Ngo Dinh Diem guy, he wasn't very well liked. People were protesting. The monk lit himself on fire, and it was a bad look for the U.S. because we're supporting that guy. So we're trying to go there and sort of like talk some sense into him, like, you need to cool it, like, let's use some common sense here. But Diem refused to discuss anything, and many Vietnamese plotters or people that were against him in November 1963 assassinated him and his brother before American advisors could get him out of the country. So he gets killed. Here you can see Henry Cabot Lodge, the American. There's Ngo Dinh Diem. Sorry about that. I should have given you a warning, but that was his dead body. So the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and this was an important one. There was a U.S. naval destroyer involved in a sea battle with a North Vietnamese battleship in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is right off the coast of Vietnam. This led to escalated U.S. involvement in the region, and some claim the incident never occurred. The Johnson administration created it to justify involvement in the conflict. So essentially, this is what gets the United States officially involved in Vietnam. JFK gets killed, so now we're like going to turn, take a 180, and we're going to go into this war full bore. And so the Johnson administration was like fully on board with this, like, all out war. We're like, we're going to win. And most people are thinking it's going to be a relatively easy victory, including Johnson. He's like, there's no way this little country is going to be able to fight us. We're going to beat them within 6 months. And so this Gulf of Tonkin incident is the event that would lead to the United States full involvement in the war. After this, conflict in the Gulf of Tonkin, this was like, okay, now we got to go fight these guys because they attacked us. And then the whole point of that last bullet is there's sort of like a conspiracy theory, and I don't know. I mean, I've heard it's true that we weren't attacked there and they kind of made this up. I don't know. I mean, the textbooks are still going to say that this happened, but the conspiracy is that it never happened and we just used it as an excuse to go, get the American people on board with fighting this war. So the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was then signed. Robert S. McNamara, this guy here, he was the Secretary of State. He's basically the guy running the war. In 1963, he advised President Johnson to aid South Vietnam to prevent the spread of communism, and this led to the Tonkin Gulf Resolution of 1964, which was a congressional resolution to use military force to prevent further aggression. It says basically granted a blank check. That means it basically gave the military full control to fight this war however they need to fight it with as many troops. And, again, this is very controversial, and this would actually lead to some amendments in the Constitution because, without congressional approval of going into an all-out war, like making a declaration of war, they still gave the military and the president the ability to fight pretty much a full-out war without having an official declaration of war. That's why it's always called the Vietnam conflict, because it was never an official war. We never officially declared war on North Vietnam. That is the Tonkin Resolution. This guy's pretty interesting.
If ever there was a cautionary tale, it is that of Robert McNamara, the best and the brightest of John F. Kennedy's New Frontier.
I have asked Robert McNamara to assume the responsibilities of Secretary of Defense.
He became the architect of the Vietnam War, in which America set out to stop the countries of Southeast Asia from falling like dominoes to communism, only to find out
we were wrong. We didn't have our history. We didn't have our culture correct.
He told that to President Johnson, and from then on tried to at least limit the killing.
I want to emphasize to you I failed. And the failure is my responsibility.
The older he got, the more clearly he saw his mistakes.
What I'm doing is thinking it through with hindsight. But you don't have hindsight available at the time.
There are many among those who fought in Vietnam and the families of the 58,000 dead who can never forgive McNamara. But give him this. By the end of his extraordinary life, he had owned up to his mistakes. David Martin, CBS News, The Pentagon.
So U.S. forces in Vietnam, the troops escalation, they called this escalation because basically you're escalating the war. The building up of U.S. military forces in Vietnam. During the war, 2 million Americans served in Vietnam. And like it says, they were a different soldier than the World War II counterparts. They were better educated. A lot of them were college educated, and they were younger than the World War II soldiers. 10,000 women who were nurses also served. And, Johnson was just, he basically, he's very adamant about winning this war and how we were going to win it. He's saying you can't show weakness, basically, or they'll just keep coming. You can see here, military forces go up, peak in 1968, and then it starts to go back down. Same thing, battle deaths here. And this is just an interesting story that relates to Vietnam, but there's actually a book called Marine Sniper, and I've read this book, and it's about, obviously, a Marine who was a sniper during Vietnam, but his name was Carlos Hathcock. He was the greatest sniper of all time, or at least he's considered by many to be the greatest sniper of all time. He had 93 confirmed kills in Vietnam, and like it says here, he was so deadly, the North Vietnamese put a $30,000 bounty on his head, which, we're talking 1960s here, so that's probably like millions of dollars in today's money. He was known as White Feather because he wore a feather in his hat, and people would get a glimpse of him and they knew that that's who it was. They were always trying to find him and try to hunt him down. And just one of the stories in the book that was pretty crazy was he went on a mission, stealth mission by himself, crawled 1,500 yards. Think about a football field's 100 yards. So he, crawled 15 football fields, on his own. And it took him 4 days without food or sleep. And he did that to kill a North Vietnamese general. So he got within range, shot the general when he came out to smoke a cigarette on the porch in the morning or something like that. And then after he shot the guy, the alarms start going off, and now he has to get out of there. He had to crawl again and got to a river. And then once he got into the river, he was able to float down the river, and then he got picked up further downstream where it was safe. But pretty interesting book if you're into military history. But there he is. And these guys, most times they have a spotter. So they're usually two-man teams, so he's the sniper, this guy's the spotter. Sometimes maybe this guy will be the sniper and he'll be the spotter, but they just kind of help you find your range and things of that nature. It's always good to have two people, but like I said, there were times where he was actually by himself, which they usually don't do. So the air war, Operation Rolling Thunder, was a bombing campaign against military targets in the north. This was a big part of the U.S. strategy, was just bomb. I mean, that's what we did, was we just bombed the heck out of them, and we thought that would force them into surrender. Like it says here, key targets were the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a network of jungle paths used for North Vietnamese to send supplies and troops. So they had kind of like a main path that they were using a lot, and that was the main target of the bombing, was like, let's destroy this main, road or highway that they're using to move all their supplies, and they won't be able to do that anymore. So that was kind of one of the strategic targets. But like it says here, bombing was not successful. Johnson increased 800 tons of bombs on North Vietnam, including napalm, which was, those of you who aren't familiar with what napalm is, it's basically a flammable liquid. So they combine, I can't tell you exactly how it's made, but it's something like they'll take sort of like gasoline or some sort of flammable, liquid, and they combine that somehow with something that ignites the fire, and then they drop that. Especially, in Vietnam, they were dropping it on the jungle, and that way they were burning away the, vegetation that was being used as cover by the enemy. And so, they were doing a lot of napalming, and they were also dropping a lot of, let me show you this picture here. They called it carpet bombing because they would literally drop it in like strips, almost like a carpet, and you would remove like strips of the jungle with each pass. There's the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You can see it was a network that went the whole way down through Vietnam. So they were bringing supplies from the north. Keep in mind, China's up here. Weapons were coming from the north, and then they would bring them down to the south, the whole way to Saigon, which was the capital of South Vietnam. So it's just pictured there. And then Agent Orange was another chemical that they were spraying over Vietnam. You can see here they were using planes to do this. And Agent Orange was another, like I said, chemical that would destroy vegetation. And so they were dropping a lot of this stuff, or spraying a lot of this stuff over there too, in order to kill the vegetation so that the enemy didn't have anywhere to hide. But the problem was our own soldiers were being exposed to it. And then after the war, a lot of soldiers came back after being exposed to Agent Orange, and they were getting cancer. So a lot of soldiers tragically died at the hands of our own military, our own government, because they were being exposed to these toxic chemicals. Obviously it wasn't intentional, but it was found out later that they were getting cancer as a result of that. So I'm just gonna...
What do you get when you mix 2,4,5-T acid and 2,4-D acid?
I'm just gonna keep going. This dude's just talking about Agent Orange. One of the aircraft that were used a lot in Vietnam was the Harrier jump jet, and they called it a jump jet because it literally takes off vertically, obviously, as opposed to most jets that use airstrips. And the reason for that is because, again, in the jungle, there's not a lot of space. There's not a lot of open fields and things of that nature where you can land a plane or even build an airstrip. So they would use this jet a lot because you could just take off, from a patch of opening in the jungle. And this was actually a British jet. This is actually a clip from a movie, and I'll show you this. It's only 3 minutes, but it's actually pretty cool. This is called True Lies, but they show you a Harrier jump jet.
Faction members, and they're holed up on the 20th floor. Now I got SWAT down there, and the cops are cordoned off the area. Harry, they got a hostage. It's Dana.
So terrorist took his daughter hostage.
I'm real sorry, Harry. I don't know what to say. I guess I grabbed her in the middle of the night or something. I had no idea. We just found out about it. But I'll tell you what, Harry, I don't want you to worry because we're going to get her back. I've already got a guy on the inside. Harry, listen, come here. We're going to get her back. Here we go.
Excuse me, Captain. Get up for your plane for a minute, okay?
Yes, sir. And listen, Forcecom, they cleared you to give us total cooperation, am I right? Yes, sir. And you know that comes directly from the President of these United States, Captain?
Sir, you're going to have to sign for this aircraft.
Oh, I'll sign for it. You got a pen? He's got one. You take care of it, would you? Hey, Harry, do you realize that it has, in fact, been 10 years since you've been behind the wheel of one of these things?
If I break it, they can take it out of my pay.
Harry, listen, don't worry about it. We got a guy on the inside, Harry. Whoa! Gotta move back, everybody. Come on, let's go! never forget, really. We might want to seek shelter!
Sorry.
Fuck!
The streets are filled with running people as the police try to evacuate the buildings. They're firing again.
Listen, Aziz's copter landed about...
All right, so, like I said, as you can see, it's pretty amazing. Those jets can take off vertically, and then, as you saw in the video there, once they're in the air, they kind of have these thrusters that can switch direction, and then they take off, straight, which is, like I said, it just to think that they're able to do that is pretty cool. But anyways, the ground war. So 1965 to 1967, the United States increased troops from 185,000 to 486,000 between that time period. So obviously a significant increase in the number of troops. And the mentality here was, the Johnson administration thought there's no way they're going to be able to withstand our sheer numbers, right? Like, we're just going to overwhelm them with force. We have so many more troops. We're so much better equipped. And, that was the strategy, was we're just going to throw so much military might at the enemy that eventually they're going to crumble. But it just wasn't working. And we kept trying more and more and more and more. And again, it just, didn't seem like we were making any progress. So the increase in the number still did not seem to be enough to defeat North Vietnam. So the U.S. started to use search and destroy missions, and like it says here, U.S. soldiers would attempt to drive the Viet Cong out of hideouts. So this is when the troops start going in by foot, and they're going into villages, and they're trying to find enemy combatants. And, there were a lot of things about this war that made it difficult to win. And one of those things was, our enemy did not play by the rules, right? And I've talked about this before, I think with World War II. Like, there are rules to war that all nations kind of agree upon. And, like when we watched Saving Private Ryan, we said you're not allowed to shoot like a medic and things of that nature. So there are rules, but the enemy didn't play by those rules. They were out to win at all costs. So if an enemy soldier had to hide with, amongst the villagers, they did that. And a lot of times the villagers would help them out too. So, the villagers, again, I mentioned this at the beginning, it's like they saw us as a foreign invader. So if you have these foreign, soldiers coming into your little town, and you have one of your own that are, there to hide, you're going to help them hide. And so that happened a lot. And pacification was the U.S. Security in rural areas. They moved residents out of their villages a lot of times, and also burned down their villages. So again, it's like now you're almost making the civilians even more hostile towards you, because you're burning down their homes and things like that in search of enemy combatants. So it's just a really messy war. I mean, you didn't know who your enemy was. Again, my uncle fought in Vietnam, and I don't really talk to him too much about it because he doesn't like to talk about it. But sometimes, I'll watch videos on YouTube and stuff, and these guys from the war said that, like, they just didn't even know who the enemy was. A lot of times you go into a village, and the enemy soldiers could be hiding right amongst the villagers, and you didn't know which ones they were. And, the government was kind of like keeping the reins on our guys, and they weren't just letting them do what they had to do to win. And it was just a messy war. And we'll get into it here, but even the war back home here in the U.S. was so divisive, amongst our own population. So I just thought this was an interesting quote. It says, "It was necessary to destroy the village to save it." A U.S. soldier said that, and you can see in this picture they're burning down the village. So he's kind of saying, like, we were burning it down to try and save them from this communist threat. But like I said, obviously people aren't going to like it if you're there burning down their village. I'm just going to keep going here. There was an event where civilians were killed, and soldiers got in trouble over this, but I'm just going to keep going. But helicopters were also a huge part of this war. Helicopters were a relatively new invention at the time. I want to say the Korean War was the first war that they used helicopters, but not to the extent that they used them in Vietnam. So again, just like I said with the Harrier, it's like you're fighting a war in a jungle where there's not a lot of open areas to land aircraft and things of that nature. And so what they started to do is they would use helicopters. And, again, helicopters were sort of like the perfect vehicle for this, because you could bring soldiers right into where they needed to be and drop them off and then just pick them up. And, so it was very effective. This is just a picture of a gunship. So you can see they're firing napalm into the jungle. They would do this often. The enemy would hide on the sides of the rivers and shoot at the U.S. soldiers that were on the river in the boats. So the media in the war. So this was, the media played a large role in American opinion about this conflict. So like it says here, American television news programs criticized the war and showed brutal battle images. And here in the U.S., the Doves were the people who were against the Vietnam War, specifically congressmen. So obviously, Congress is oftentimes split on various issues. So in Congress, the Doves were against the war, and then the Hawks supported the goals of the Vietnam War. And our nation was very divided on this war. And again, a big part of that is this is the first time that war was being televised. So there were news crews like right in with the soldiers fighting, and reporters like reporting from the battlefield while people are getting shot, and they're seeing, so all these images and scenes of actual like war were being sent back to the States, and people were watching it and they were like horrified because, in previous wars, I mean, you read news reports and things like that. It was all filtered. The government and the military could kind of filter what was getting back to the American public. But in this war, because it was kind of like raw and uncensored, people were to it. But the anti-war movement back here in the U.S., so Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, was a civil rights activist group. The SDS led the first national anti-war demonstration in Washington, D.C. on April 17, 1965. So just kind of keep that in mind. And we mentioned this before when we talked about MLK. He was a strong advocate against the war, very outspoken critic. Basically he would say, like, we don't need to be fighting this war. We're pouring tons of money into this war that, we don't even need to really be fighting. Meanwhile, people back here in the U.S. are suffering, and we could be using that money here to help people, in various ways in our own country. So the longer the war went on, the greater the protests became. And that's pretty standard when it comes to war. A lot of times when wars start, people are kind of like, they're not really sure how they feel about it. But once the death toll starts to pile up and the war goes on for a long period of time and it affects the economy and things of that nature, a lot of times people start to turn against the war. And so this war would go on for about a decade. And so that's a long war, if you think about it. So, like I said, as the war raged on, the anti-war sentiment continued to grow. And this guy here in the picture, obviously he's a protester, but he's burning his draft card. So, young men 18 to, I believe it was 35, would have to basically register for the draft, and they would get a draft card. It's just like an ID kind of with a number on it. And then they would do a lottery, and they would pull the numbers, and then, that's how the draft kind of worked, was just by lottery. And so these guys would burn their draft cards in protest, saying, I'm not going even if I do get drafted. And so again, you see a lot of these types of pictures. Won't fight the rich man's war. A lot of times that's kind of how these wars are viewed, is that these rich politicians get us into wars, and then, the normal people, or maybe even the poor people, are the ones that have to go and fight it and die sometimes. So, guilty of murder, LBJ. So, again, LBJ, obviously, he came into office after JFK was assassinated in 64, close to, basically almost 65. And he would only be in office for a couple years. And, we mentioned before that LBJ's main priorities when he became president were ending poverty, the war on poverty, and ending racial discrimination. So that was kind of what he wanted to do when he became president. But like, I mentioned before, during the Civil Rights Movement, he got sidetracked with this war in Vietnam that he never thought would go on this long. And there's a lot of pictures of him like this where he seems very distraught and, essentially kind of lost as far as like what to do about this war, because I believe that LBJ thought the enemy in Vietnam just could not withstand the military might of the U.S. So his mentality was, we'll just throw a ton of troops at it, and they'll surrender within a few months, maybe a year or two, and then the war just continued to rage on, and our strategy wasn't working. And so that was what became so frustrating. But, like I said, a lot of protests on college campuses and things of that nature. And so the government in conflict, as I mentioned a minute ago, the Hawks, President Johnson and Secretary of State Dean Rusk believed the U.S. was helping defend an ally against communist aggression. And then the Doves, led by William Fulbright, was a critic to communist aggression. So basically those were the two sides in Congress on, supporting the war versus not supporting the war. And so this brings us to the Tet Offensive. So January 30th, 1968 was the start of the Tet, which is the Vietnamese New Year. And late on that evening, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong guerrillas struck countless villages. Like it says here, 100 cities and 12 U.S. military bases were attacked on that evening. And this caused a major shift in the American public opinion against the war, because the media, or the government, I should maybe say, military, they were reporting that we were winning the war and the enemy was close to surrendering. And so, the American public were led to believe that this war was going to end soon. And then the Tet Offensive happened, and it was this massive attack by the enemy on, like it says here, all these cities and U.S. military bases. And then people realized, like, oh no, the enemy is not ready to surrender. And so it really turned public opinion, and this is the map of all the places that were attacked during the Tet Offensive. But Americans realized that the enemy was not ready to surrender, and we were kind of being deceived into thinking that this war was almost over. And so the tunnel rats were an interesting part of the war. The North Vietnamese had actually dug a vast complex of tunnels underneath the ground. And keep in mind, it wasn't just the Vietnam conflict with the U.S., it was also the war that they fought against the French and the Chinese and all other foreign invaders prior to U.S. involvement. So they had, dug these tunnels over years and decades of, just war. And they could live down there. You could see they had bunks. It's like literally they could live underground. So this is why the U.S. bombing wasn't effective, because we would drop bombs and the enemy would just go underground. We could attack them and they could hide and things like that. So it was a huge advantage for them. And so, we basically had tunnel rats, and these were the guys who would actually like literally go underground into the tunnels with like a flashlight and a pistol looking for enemy combatants. And, sometimes they found them. And you could only imagine what that would be like, if you were underground with a flashlight and a gun and you run into an enemy combatant. It's, it's not going to be pretty, but the enemy would set traps all over these tunnels so that if U.S. soldiers were down there, they would, come across traps. And also they were above ground traps too. So just traps set in the jungle itself, just for, the enemy, which was us, when we're patrolling through the jungles and things like that, there'd be like little traps like this set where soldiers would step on it and it would go through their feet, and, pretty horrific stuff. But these tunnels are still there. There's a tunnel rat coming out. You can see he has a gas mask on there because sometimes they would put poison gas and things like that in there. But here they are pulling one of their comrades out. He's underground. So, pretty scary job. Those are demolitions. So they blow them up sometimes, try and destroy the tunnels. The tunnels are still there today. Like I said, you can go to Vietnam. Tourism is one of their main commodities now. So there's a lot of tourism in Vietnam. You can go there and, actually go underground and stuff like that. So that's just a video on the tunnels. I'm going to keep going though. So William Westmoreland was commander of the U.S. forces, considered the Tet Offensive a North Vietnamese defeat because they failed to conquer South Vietnam. So he's trying to give an optimistic report on the Tet Offensive, saying like, it's not that big of a deal. Here he is talking to Johnson. So this brings us to the election of 1968. After the Tet Offensive, 3 out of 4 Americans disapproved of Johnson's conduct of the war. So basically, American opinion is turning against this war. With the presidential election nearing, Johnson was under attack from all sides. He's in trouble. And believe it or not, Johnson, it's kind of interesting because he was only president for a couple years. He didn't serve a second term. And then after he was president, he didn't live much longer. I think I've looked into this. I remember reading where he was smoking 4 packs a day or something of cigarettes. He was said he was all stressed out, and, I think he was drinking a lot and stuff like that. So basically, he was kind of destroyed after this. So Democratic challengers in the election of 1968, Eugene McCarthy was a senator from Minnesota, and Robert F. Kennedy, so obviously brother of the slain JFK, seemed to have the nomination. But on the night of the California primary, this guy in the picture, Ciron Ciron, was a young Jordanian immigrant, shot him, and Kennedy would die the next day, 26 hours later. So Kennedy had just finished giving a speech. Again, he's in California, and he's walking through the kitchen of the hotel, I guess it was, and this assassin was waiting for him there, shot him. It's a picture of him dying, obviously, but I believe they got him to a hospital, and then he bled out or something there. But again, there is conspiracy talk behind this, that it was the CIA again. The guy that shot him, who I believe is actually still alive. I believe he's still in prison in California. But the assassin didn't remember shooting him. So again, there's all this conspiracy talk that the CIA had kind of programmed him to kind of be a sleeper assassin, which is somebody who you kind of trigger somehow, by reading a book or hearing some sort of phrase, and then it triggers them, they commit the job, and then they forget about it. And, again, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but the famous book Catcher in the Rye, a lot of people in conspiracy circles think that that's a trigger because a number of assassins were found in possession of that book after they committed the murder. So the guy who killed John Lennon had a copy. Ciron Ciron, when they went to his apartment, he had a copy. So I don't know, but you can look into that if you're interested. So the convention in Chicago, vice president under Johnson was Herbert Humphrey. He would receive the nomination. And the convention in Chicago was underscored by the 10,000 anti-war protesters rallying in Grant Park. So there was a lot of anti-war people outside of the convention causing a lot of chaos. The Republicans capitalized on this, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. So the Democrats are kind of left without a real strong candidate. And then Richard Nixon, who we talked about before, who had been defeated by JFK previously, he dominated the Republican National Convention, Miami Beach, Florida. Election results: Nixon captures 32 states in their electoral college votes. Humphrey captures only 13. George Wallace also ran for the American Independent Party, and he carried 5 states in the South. Keep in mind, Wallace was the guy I talked about with the Civil Rights Movement. He was an open segregationist. And again, I mentioned that somebody tried to kill him. And we watched Forrest Gump. I think they actually show that scene where he gets shot. But he didn't. He survived the assassination attempt, but regardless, he did try to run, and you can see he did win some of these states in the Deep South. But for the most part, Nixon won by pretty much what would be considered a landslide. So Nixon is now the president. Vietnamization and Cambodia. President Nixon made foreign affairs a priority. So he's, obviously this war is going to be a priority for him as president. He's got to figure out how to put an end to this. He brings on Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who actually just passed away last year, I believe. The guy was 100 years old or something. But he was Nixon's key foreign policy advisor and later Secretary of State. So this was the guy who was really kind of giving him advice on what he would need to do to end this war. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973 for his role in negotiating peace and ending the Vietnam War. Vietnamization involved turning the fighting over to the South Vietnamese while gradually pulling out U.S. troops. So Vietnamization was a name given to the plan of ending the war in Vietnam for the United States, and that plan involved us turning over the war to our allies, South Vietnamese allies, and then also simultaneously pulling U.S. troops out of the country for good. So in 1969, 540,000 troops were in Vietnam, and by 1972, there were only 24,200 troops, and that was a result of this process of Vietnamization. Henry Kissinger met with Lee Duc-Tho, a longtime revolutionary of North Vietnam, trying to negotiate some sort of peace agreement. Nixon's plan, like it says here, Nixon secretly planned to expand the war into Cambodia to cut off the North Vietnamese supply line. In 1969, he ordered the widespread bombing of Cambodia and concealed the Cambodian airstrikes from the American people, Congress, and other government officials. His actions eventually led to Cambodia being non-neutral in the Vietnam incident. So essentially, we're kind of secretly bombing the neighboring countries of Vietnam, but this would kind of push them towards joining the communists because obviously they didn't want us bombing them. So here you see Vietnam, and then Laos and Cambodia were the countries to the west of Vietnam. Anti-war protests in the U.S. increased. So this tragic incident occurred at Kent State. Like it says here, news of Cambodia provoked outrage throughout the United States on May 4th, 1970, after a college student at Kent State, Ohio, burned the ROTC building. So they lit the basically a military building on fire. The National Guard shot into a crowd and killed 4 and injured 9 others. The Kent State shooting shocked the nation. There was also a shooting at Jackson State College, led to student and faculty strikes. Congress was also in an uproar about the Cambodian invasion and repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the War Powers Act. So basically, this was what they passed at the beginning of the war that gave the president and the military the ability to fight the war. And now Congress has repealed this and basically putting limits on the military and the president and what they can do in regards to Vietnam. These are just some still pictures of the Kent State incident. So U.S. troops, I guess, fired into a crowd. This is one of the students that was killed. Pretty famous picture there. Neil Young, like he says, not a big Nixon fan, but he wrote a song called 4 Dead in Ohio about these 4 students. Again, I'm just going to keep going here. So the Pentagon Papers, another incident sparked protest in 1971. New York Times published a collection of secret government documents relating to the war. The Pentagon Papers, as they were called, revealed that the government had misled the American people about the course of the war. Like it says, our government lied. So basically, the government was saying that the war was going better than it was, and I think they were manipulating numbers and things like that to make it look better on our end. And so that all got kind of exposed. The war continues. President Nixon then ordered the invasion of Cambodia and renewed the bombing of North Vietnam. Nixon miscalculated the opposition's reaction. Despite Vietnamization, the war intensified under Nixon. So again, Nixon's in trouble. He's trying to end the war, and it's not an easy task. But, like it says here, the madman theory is what Nixon would sort of adopt as his strategy. And what this madman theory was basically, I'll just try to summarize this real quick. Nixon wanted the North Vietnamese enemy, the communists, to believe that he was a madman. He was like crazy. And if they thought that he was crazy, they would be afraid that he would drop a nuke on them. And so basically that's kind of what he was trying to sell to the enemy, was that if they don't end this war with us, if they don't come to some sort of peace agreement, Nixon's going to push the nuclear button and he's going to wipe them off the face of the earth. And the strategy seemed to work. And it's kind of interesting, and I don't want to jump ahead here, but Nixon eventually is going to basically be removed from office. And it's kind of crazy because as soon as Nixon left office, the North Vietnamese invaded the South. And it's kind of like, because they weren't afraid anymore. So Nixon's madman, theory, or his attempt to make the enemy think that he was crazy, led to them, wanting to negotiate a peace agreement with us. So in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge kind of took control. Rouge was French for red, so they were communists. Communism and red are always associated. They took over Cambodia. The U.S. withdrew its support, and this led to the killing fields. The communists eliminated all quote-unquote intellectuals. So basically anybody they thought was educated, anybody who wore glasses, anybody who didn't have calluses on their hands like a farmer, anybody who seemed to be somewhat intelligent was for the most part, executed. And the reason for that was because they didn't want people who could think for themselves. They didn't want people who went against the regime. And so they eliminated all political enemies. Like it says here, mass murder ensued. Estimated deaths between 1.2 and 1.7 million. Mass graves were found all throughout the country. People died of execution, disease, and starvation. Pol Pot was the leader of the Khmer Rouge. So there he is. So he's a pretty bad guy. Executed a lot of people. Yep, human skulls, mass graves. Tragic event. The Hanoi Hilton was a famous POW camp, prisoner of war camp, where a lot of U.S. prisoners were held. I actually read a book about this. Pretty crazy. Starve the people, starve the guys, hang them up, beat them, tie their hands behind their backs. And it's just pretty crazy stuff. But so Nixon's re-election, George McGovern, 1972, was the Democratic candidate, ran on an anti-war platform. Democrats brought some new rules to increase representation of ethnic minorities. According to the 26th Amendment that was passed, it lowered the voting age from 21 to 18 to encourage voting. And the argument was, if you're old enough to die for your country, you should be able to vote. And this is interesting because when the war started, the voting age was 21. So you could be drafted into the war, but you couldn't vote. And so obviously that's a big problem, because it's like, if you're old enough to be drafted and have to possibly go fight and die, you should at least have a say in whether or not we go to war, or at least who's in charge of making that decision. So up until this point, the voting age was 21, but now, they lowered it to 18. Republicans were Richard Nixon again, and Spiro Agnew as his running mate. Nixon wins overwhelmingly. Here's Nixon talking to some Vietnam soldiers. Wow, look at this. So Nixon wins huge. A ceasefire at last. October 1972, North Vietnam offered peace that President Nixon's Secretary of State Henry Kissinger considered. It included a ceasefire, pull out of all U.S. troops, end to U.S. military aid, a creation of a new government in South Vietnam, and Ngo Van True would be the president. The United States, after careful consideration, rejected compromise, and President Nixon ordered around-the-clock bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong for 3 months. So we're still bombing. So a new plan was created under the United States would withdraw its troops but still provide aid to South Vietnam under the Paris Peace Accords. There would be a prisoner exchange agreement. We had prisoners, they had prisoners. Let's exchange. 2 years after the United States withdrew its troops, South Vietnam unconditionally surrendered to North Vietnam. The end result, ironically enough, the domino theory never occurred, and communism on an international level was not as much of a threat as anticipated. So essentially, once the U.S. got out of there, the North, the communist North, overran the South, invaded the South, took it over. And again, going back to what I mentioned a second ago, it's kind of interesting because once Nixon was out of office after Watergate, the North was no longer afraid, so they overran the South, and then today Vietnam is unified, and it's a communist country. It's one of only, I think, 5 communist countries in the world now. Saigon, which was the capital city of South Vietnam, was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. There was a mass evacuation of South Vietnam. So a lot of people who were on the side of the U.S. or U.S. allies, they were all trying to get out of there before the communists came, because communists are probably going to execute their enemies, anybody who helped the U.S. So you could see, just pictures like this where there's just tons of people trying to get out of the country. The U.S. was getting out of there. They started even just dump military supplies. Obviously, here's a helicopter being dumped into the ocean. It's just like, let's get out of here, get rid of everything. This is a picture of American POWs, prisoners of war, coming home. This is actually a picture of one of the prisoners of war when he was reunited with his family. Actually, that's the book I read, was this guy's story. Operation Baby Lift and New Life, 3,300 infants and 110,000 refugees from the war were trying to escape the communists and find a better life. There were a lot of babies, a lot of orphans. So pretty crazy, but, we tried to take care of them. Again, these are just mass evacuations. You can see here people getting on helicopters, airplanes, boats, anything they could do to get out of the country. Again, same thing here. It's just people were scared, scared for their lives. So the effects of the war: Vietnamese casualties, 185,000 soldiers dead, 500,000 civilians, 800,000 orphans. As a result of the war, Vietnam veterans, there were 2 million Americans who fought in Vietnam, 58,000 killed in action, 300,000 wounded, 600 American prisoners of war. Veterans became targets for the anger, guilt, and shame of fellow citizens marked by the war. Unfortunately, sometimes when the soldiers would come home, they would be met at the airport by protesters, and sometimes they were spit on, like the soldiers were spit on and called names and things like that. So it's pretty sad that they were, disrespected when they got home, because let's keep in mind, a lot of these guys weren't there because they wanted to be. They were drafted a lot of times. My uncle came back, and he was in they flew into California because they're coming from Vietnam, and they fly into California. He said before the plane landed, one of their sergeants or something said, just to warn you guys, there's going to be protesters here to kind of harass you guys when you get off the plane. And when my uncle told the story, he kind of laughed about it. He said, I'm just coming from a country where people are trying to kill me. So he said, that's not going to bother me. So, it didn't seem to get to him too much. A lot of veterans of the war. I mean, a lot of guys injured like this, but also a lot of PTSD, again, just firsthand experience. I know my uncle had a lot of issues when he came back, and as did a lot of the soldiers, because of the things they experienced over there. And you see this flag flown a lot, POW-MIA, meaning like missing in action. So prisoners of war missing in action. So there were some soldiers who were never found or accounted for. It says you are not forgotten. So this is in honor of them. So, we don't know what happened to them. Sometimes they recover bodies. There was actually a guy who was, I think he was a major. He was a pilot from Peaburg, and they found his remains over there maybe like 10 years or so ago, and they brought him back, and they had a parade here and stuff, and had a funeral and for him. So this is actually the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. Again, here's the wall. I'm sure some of you have seen this. These are all names of people who were killed over there.